So what we're going to be doing in today's class is we're going to start off our look today at a special topic, one that I focus a lot of my research on, which is picture perception. And we're going to see that picture perception throughout the coming weeks, while it's a very specialized thing that humans do, it does give us tools to access and understand the representations that we're using for vision in general. So we're going to be spending some time on picture perception in the coming classes. However, before we get to that, we do have some unfinished business with signal detection. So we're going to begin there today and wrap up our look at signal detection. So just by way of review, last class we introduced the idea of signal detection. And we introduced the idea that you could measure somebody's sensitivity. So you could measure a perceptual system's sensitivity, their ability to detect a target versus deciding that the target was not present by comparing their ability to say yes when the target is there versus their ability to say no when the target is absent. And the idea of signal detection theory is based on the idea that you have a certain amount of evidence here on the x-axis, and that's the evidence that a signal is actually present, right? So that's the evidence that you get partly from your perceptual system that a signal has actually occurred. So if it's a noise, part of the evidence would be the neurons that are firing in your auditory system because of that noise. And what signal detection theory gave us, one of its major contributions, was this idea that when there is no signal, you still have a noise distribution. So when no signal is being given off, when there's nothing out there stimulating your senses, you still have inner sensations. You still have the workings of your perceptual system firing. And that gives you this noise distribution. And this is basically, you can think of it as false evidence that is always going to be present. So the noise distribution is always present. Sometimes the evidence that it provides is very low, but that's very infrequent. Sometimes the evidence that it provides is very high. Your nervous system is just jacked and going crazy for some reason. That's also very rare. But most of the time, it would give you, a certain amount of activation in your perceptual system. When there's a signal, that signal provides additional evidence. And what that does is it moves your entire noise distribution further up the evidence axis to this point over here, where it's now your signal plus noise distribution. So if your noise distribution, if the amount of noise in your perceptual system was right here before the signal, it moves to here after the signal. If instead your noise distribution was right here before the signal, it moves here after the signal. And what we do in our decision making, whether we detect something or don't detect something, is we pick a criterion, we pick a level of evidence. And above that level, we will say that yes, the signal was there. And below that level, we will say no, the signal is not there. And that gives 4 possible outcomes for any signal detection situation. So if the signal is there, and we say, yes, it's there because our activation is above the criterion. If the signal is there and we say yes, that's called a hit. If, on the other hand, the signal is there, but it falls below our criterion and we say no, the signal wasn't there, that's a miss. If the noise distribution is the only distribution active, if there's no signal, and we say no because the evidence is below criterion, that's known as a correct rejection. We've correctly rejected that there's a signal. If, on the other hand, there is no signal, but our activation is above criterion, we will say, yes, I heard something, or I saw something, or I detected that signal, and that is known as a false alarm. There was a question? Yeah. Yep, okay. All right, so that's our brief recap. And as we saw, we could measure people's abilities to detect these different targets in the midst of different noises. We took a look at the star fields. And we saw that you could actually measure how good you are at detecting certain targets by measuring your false alarm rates, your hit rates, and basically determining how far away the signal and the noise is in your distribution. And importantly, when that signal and noise is very far away from each other, that's when we have high sensitivity. So if the signal and noise distribution is far away from just the noise distribution, this distance is high, that means your sensitivity is high. That means most of the time you're going to be correct in saying that there is a target, and most of the time you're going to be correct when you say there isn't a target. On the other hand, when that gets more and more difficult, as we saw with the 1,000 star field, when there is very little distance between the signal plus noise distribution, the one here in blue, and the noise alone distribution, when that distance is very small, that means that your sensitivity is very low, that you cannot discriminate, you cannot correctly detect when there's a signal and when there's a noise, and that means that your perceptual system is unable, insensitive to this particular stimulus. All right, so we saw that applied to stars when you're trying to detect stars in a star field. So let's take it out of the lab and see what this might have to say about important social topics, such as the Me Too movement and the idea of consent and sexual activity, sexual harassment. What does this have to say about what is going on, and how can we improve things to make sure that we are not sexually harassing people, but at the same time that we don't put an end to all sexual activity, which would be bad as well. So we brought up Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey. These are two alleged instances of sexual assault, and we'll see what signal detection theory can say about that. And then we'll also take a look at other cases where popular opinion was split. So this is Aziz Ansari, who went out on a date with a woman, and his perception of the date was that they engaged in consensual sexual activity. Her perception of the date was that they did not. So we're going to see also what signal detection theory can tell us about what happened here, and also moving forward, how to make sure that things like this do not happen in the future. All right, so we're going to set this up first. So once again, we're going to, the challenge here is to take determining whether or not somebody is, somebody wants sexual activity versus they do not want sexual activity. That is your target. That's what you're trying to determine. And we have to translate that into a signal detection paradigm here. So here we're going to have evidence, once again, on the x-axis, and we're going to have the frequency of impressions. And this evidence is going to be the evidence, and we're going to put you in the decision-making seat here. This is the evidence that you have that your person that you're interacting with wants to engage in sexual activity. So we'll make the assumption that you yourself want to engage in sexual activity, and now you have to decide, the person that you're engaging with, is that desire present in them or is that desire absent in them? And there's going to be certain amounts of evidence that you can tune to. So the noise distribution here, this is the amount of evidence when the person that you're interacting with does not want to have sex. All right, so when the person you're interacting with does not want to engage in sex, you do, but they do not, there's going to be a certain amount of evidence that you are going to perceive from that person. If for no other reason than your perceptual systems are being active, if for no other reason that there could be ambiguous information. So you might say to yourself, well, you know, they touch their hair. You know, that's evidence, right? Maybe I've invited them up for coffee and they said yes, evidence, right? So all of these sort of things can occur. There's a certain amount of evidence when the person you are interacting with does not want to engage in sexual activity. there is a certain amount of evidence, and this is the signal plus noise distribution, when the person that you're engaging with does want to engage in sexual activity. So this is when the signal of, yes, this person wants to engage, is added to the evidence that is there when they do not want to engage. So this is the noise distribution. No external evidence is being given, but evidence is still being perceived. This is the noise, the signal plus noise distribution. Evidence is being given, and this is the distribution where the evidence is given. So what does signal detection theory tell us about this particular situation? Well, we choose a criterion, and above that, we are going to decide that the person does want to have sex. Below that, we're going to decide that the person does not want to have sex. And notice that this criterion leads to once again, four different outcomes. So that's the sensitivity for the outcomes. And let's see what happens in this situation here when the person that we're engaging with actually does want to have sex. So the person that we're engaging with in this social encounter, they actually do want to engage in sexual activity. And if you make the decision that yes, they do want to engage in sexual activity, well then that is a hit. So they want to engage. You correctly decide that they do want to engage. That's called a hit. If on the other hand, they want to engage, so again, this is when they want to engage in sex, and you decide that they do not, that is called, once again, a miss. So in this situation, this is the benign situation. In this situation, if you correctly get a hit, then you engage in sexual activity. You want to engage, they want to engage, you make the decision, or that you've detected a signal so that you initiate sexual activity. And it turns out everybody's on board, and that is that's a hit. This one over here, this is also pretty benign because in this case, it's just a missed opportunity. So this is when at the end of the night you say, well, you know what, I've had a wonderful time, and I will see you next time. We should do this again. And you walk out the door, and the person is saying to themselves, what happened? Why am I here alone right now? I was giving off signals, right? I was giving off evidence. This is that missed opportunity. Again, not so bad. So that's the situation where the person does want to engage in sexual activity. This is the dangerous one. So this is where the person does not want to engage in sexual activity. And again, via a signal detection theory paradigm, even when somebody does not want to engage in sexual activity, the person who's trying to make that decision has a noise distribution that is being activated. Either behaviors are being misinterpreted, either their own perceptual system is seeing things that aren't there. They have that phrase in English, you're projecting all over this. Something is going on when there is no signal. If that evidence falls below the criterion, then the person correctly decides that this person does not want to engage in sexual activity, so they don't initiate. If, on the other hand, this evidence falls above criterion, then that is a false alarm, and that is where the trouble begins. So the correct rejection here, that's just everybody walks away okay. So maybe you wanted to engage that night, but you correctly determined the person you're socializing with does not. So you're like, all right, I'm going to go home. And they're sitting there all alone saying, well, that ended well because I did not want to engage tonight. On the other hand, this one down here, that's a false alarm and that's sexual assault. So that's when you engage, when you start doing behaviors that are not consented to, when you start grabbing things that you should not be grabbing, and that is when sexual assault occurs. So we can see here that we can go from detecting stars in a star field to basically detecting what occurs in a very complex situation. However, it can be boiled down to the idea that you are trying to detect a target and you have to make the decision based on the amount of evidence that you have. And if you have a criterion in a certain location and you have a certain sensitivity to picking up on this evidence, then again, you can have a correct hit, which is sexual activity, correct rejection, which is everybody walks away okay, miss, which is that missed opportunity, and then again, that false alarm, which in that case would be sexual assault. So given this layout here, there's a couple of things that it suggests that we can do, that people can do in order to get rid of a certain area of this. So what is the area that we want to get rid of on this graph?
Sexual assault.
Sexual assault. So what we want to do is we want to figure out strategies. We want to figure out things that we can do, ways we can change society in order that this area here goes away, right? So that's kind of like goal number one. Let's make that area there go away. So let's take a look at some ways that people have attempted to do this. So I took a look at IUSB's, actually I think this is IU's policies on sexual assault, sexual harassment, and on consent. And they have right here consent, and they are talking how consent is an agreement expressed through affirmative, voluntary words or actions. So in a lot of consensual discussions, the idea of affirmative, not just implied, not the lack of objections, but affirmative, and oftentimes they don't even have the actions there. They just have voluntary words, where you literally have to say, I want to have sex with you, I consent to this activity. There's these affirmative voluntary words. So what does a policy like this do? What does a policy like this do if everybody starts adopting this particular policy? Well, what it does is it says that this is your criteria for determining if somebody wants to engage in sexual activity. This is your new criteria. So take whatever criteria you had before, which was not enough, because look, we got this little area right here that we don't want. And if we're going to move that criterion over here, where this is providing much more evidence, right? This is requiring much more evidence. It's saying this is the evidence that is required from the person you're interacting with. So what that means is that this level of evidence is insufficient, and that policy is basically saying take your criterion and move it over to this evidence location there. And then what that does is it does a few things. Number one, the sexual assault disappears, right? Because this little area here, this noise distribution no longer reaches beyond that criterion. So the sexual assault is completely gone. Now, when sex is not wanted, everybody walks away okay. But look at what else happened, and this is oftentimes a criticism of these sorts of policies that you'll hear about. The missed opportunities have skyrocketed. So while we no longer have any false alarms, the missed opportunities here have vastly increased. And this is one of the common criticisms that you'll hear about a lot of these consensual policies, is that they're just going to stop, any sexual activity whatsoever. That nobody is going to adhere to that much evidence. Nobody's going to be able to provide that much evidence. So yeah, you can move the criterion, but that means that a lot of people are going to be going home with that missed opportunity, leaving a lot of other people wondering what the heck happened. I was providing all of this evidence, but now because of this new criterion, we've set that criterion rather high in order that sexual assault is taken care of. So, any suggestions what we could do? Because while this is great that we don't have sexual assault over here, this I don't think is very socially desirable either.
Increase the sensitivity.
We could increase the sensitivity, exactly. So the one thing that we can do We can't move this criterion anywhere back here without risking, going back to sexual assault here. Because while theoretically this kind of ends here, it could be, we don't exactly know where it is. But while we don't want to move the criterion back, one thing that we could do is increase this sensitivity. And one of the things that I've noticed occurring in society is that we are slowly shifting towards ways of increasing that sensitivity. And one way of increasing that sensitivity is increasing the noise. So the same way that you could increase the sensitivity of your being able to detect a target by simply making the target louder or making the target brighter, you can increase the amount of evidence that is being given so that the criterion still won't cross over into the sexual assault area, but this will move to a point where we have less missed opportunities. So I mentioned that this seems to be one of the places where society is going. So as evidence of this, I was looking up advice articles in Cosmopolitan magazine, one of the premier kind of lifestyle magazines. And what I was looking for was an article on playing hard to get. So playing hard to get, if you put it back into that signal detection theory, playing hard to get is literally not giving a lot of signal, right? Playing hard to get is not providing a lot of signal. When you actually do want to engage in sexual activity, you hold back on your evidence. And what I was gratified to find was that when I looked for articles on playing hard to get, so this was recent, this was last week. You can see Ariana Grande pulled out of the Grammys and other things you're going to want to see in the March 2019 issue. The most recent article I could find on playing hard to get was from 2012. So that's like 6 years ago. It was December of 2012. So that was like just about 6 years ago. So clearly there seems to have been a recent shift in the idea that maybe playing hard to get, where is it? Men and women are attracted to potential partners who play hard to get. Science proves that those feelings are valid in at least in part. A series of 4 studies published in the European Journal of Psychology. Women and men are attracted to potential partners who play hard to get. So science says you're more attracted to people that pull back on that evidence. But signal detection theory says what we need in order to make sure that more targets are being detected while we do not have a return to any false alarms is you got to increase that sensitivity. And one way to do that is to just provide more evidence. So if society moves away from that idea of playing hard to get, playing coy, being demure, not communicating your desires here, if we go back to that, then our only option is to keep massive amounts of missed opportunities. On the other hand, if society changes enough where people are more open and evidence is given more frequently, well then this signal plus noise moves over here, and you can see that same criterion, the voluntary words or actions, stays in place, but now the missed opportunities has gone down to almost nothing, and the correct hits of yes, they want to engage in sexual activity, and I've made that correct determination, has skyrocketed. And again, this is kind of where we want to get to as a society. All right, any questions on that? All right, so a couple more. So again, consent moves the criterion. Playing hard to get or not playing hard to get moves the evidence. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up on this is just another kind of example of this. And this is for the Aziz Ansari situation. No, actually, no. This is for a more borderline situation. Something that is coming up a lot in workplaces, and that is the idea of sexual harassment. So once again, sexual harassment can often be defined as unwanted sexual attention. And one of the things that signal detection theory can allow us to analyze is how to best get rid of unwanted sexual attention. So there are cases where people do not want sexual attention. They do not want comments on their bodies or how they look or anything of that nature. There are other times when people do want that type of attention. So sometimes you will see people and they bought that new pair of jeans and they're just kind of walking in front of you endlessly, and all of a sudden you're like, your jeans look fantastic. And they're like, oh, really, these things? Oh, I'm so glad you noticed, right? Sometimes people do want that attention, right? So we have two situations. And again, we have this situation where you as the person who is reading this social situation has to decide. Does this person not want me to comment on their, for example, physical appearance? Or do they want to comment on their physical appearance, right? So again, that idea of they're sending out signals that maybe they do want you to comment on. The clearest example of this is not exactly sexual attention, but the clearest example of this is the person who just recently got engaged and has that engagement ring, and they will do everything possible to kind of, it's like, oh, really, that over there, that thing over, that's a signal to say they want you to say, oh my gosh, look at that ring. So they do want that attention. All right, so once again, we have this signal detection theory. If the person does not want sexual attention and their evidence falls below criterion, then you say nothing and everybody walks away okay. If somebody does want sexual attention and if their evidence falls above criterion and you say to them, wow, you're looking great in that shirt. Have you been working out? And they're like, oh yeah, thank you for noticing all my hard work. Thank you for, it's like, looking good in that jacket. Oh, thank you so much. You've got a hit. You've done that correctly. If they do want attention, but their evidence falls below criterion, that's a missed opportunity. And once again, those are the benign situations. Because if somebody was like, man, I've been working out really hard, I think my butt looks great in these jeans, and I've been walking around all day and nobody said anything. It's like, well, it takes 2 weeks for your friends to notice and it takes 4 weeks for other people to notice. So let me go back to the gym. But again, not that bad. This is the one that we want to avoid. This is where sexual harassment occurs. So again, in a workplace, this is where you do not want attention or compliments. And somebody walks up to you and says, oh my goodness, you are looking good in that blouse. And you're like, no, that is not what I wanted. That's not what I wanted to hear. Sexual harassment. So again, what can we do in order to fix this? And one thing, again, that I remember reading about was the rock test. So is anybody here familiar with the rock test? So one issue with sexual harassment is that it, a lot of times, it happens to women in the workplace. So that's not to say it doesn't happen to other people. That's not to say that unwanted sexual comments do not occur across the genders. But it has been an issue and has come to attention in terms of women in the workplace receiving that sexual attention when they do not want that sexual attention. And examples would be if somebody has a lunch meeting and you have to go out to a lunch meeting with a woman coworker, and you're sitting there and you want to decide, does she want that sexual attention or does she not? Should I compliment her appearance or should I not? And she does not want it. But you're sitting there going, you know what? She agreed to come to this lunch meeting, and she's wearing actually a nice blouse, and she touched her collar a few times. Yeah, she wants that compliment, so I'm going to do something nice. I'm going to say, hey, you know what? That is a good-looking blouse. And all of a sudden, you go into this territory over here. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is we can move that criterion. So this was a tweet, I think it was from last year, 2 years ago, about the rock test. So Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson personally endorsed the rock test. And what the rock test is that before you give somebody a compliment, and this is probably geared towards males, before you give somebody a compliment, ask yourself, would you give the rock that compliment? So before you tell somebody that their butt looks great in those jeans, Ask yourself, if I was having lunch with The Rock, would I say that? And if the answer is yes, then go ahead and give that compliment, because clearly there's been enough evidence. But if the answer is no, if you would not tell this man that his butt looks great in those jeans, then do not tell whoever you're sitting with that their butt looks great in those jeans. And again, from a signal detection point of view, what this is doing is, again, is taking that criterion and it's saying, this is my criterion for giving somebody a compliment. This is my criterion for giving The Rock a compliment. If I'm going to compliment The Rock, I better be massively sure that he actually wants to hear that comment on his physical appearance. And again, what it does is it decreases the sexual harassment. Sure, it's going to increase the missed opportunities, but that's not, a big deal. But again, it moves that criterion and gets rid of that problem area, that area of sexual harassment. Mm-hmm.
So, why The Rock? How do you get the correlation between like The Rock and the person sitting across from?
So, why The Rock? For no other reason than he's famous, and I think people know who he is. Plus, he is physically intimidating. But basically, what they're saying is, a lot of times, and this is another really interesting thing that comes out of analyses of sexual harassment. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to understand why this occurs, because we want to make sure that we get rid of these bad behaviors. That's what psychologists do. So why The Rock? Number one, he's famous, so people would know who he is. But number two, he is intimidating. He is a male as well. There's a lot of things about him that would increase that criterion. So it's kind of like, it's sort of, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Can't really think of a good example here. But basically, it increases your criterion. It basically says that's the amount of evidence that you need. So one of the very interesting findings, and part of the reason why this might work the way that it does, is that there have been studies on actual perceived sexual attraction. So what is it? What behaviors or what properties can be placed in a situation where somebody will perceive that somebody else is sexually attracted to them, right? Somebody will perceive that somebody else wants to have sex with them. And what they did in this study was they set up a video, and you were told that you were going to see a video of a person that you were going to be working with in this experiment. So the experiment was supposed to be for two individuals. You were the real subject, and then you watched the video. And in the video, it was an opposite sex partner in the video, and they would just talk about themselves. They'd be like, oh, my name is this, blah, 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 this, and this. And what they asked you after watching the video was, how likely do you think that person would be interested in going out on a date with you? And how likely do you think that person would be to have sex with you, right? So they were asking for your judgment based on that video of how likely do you think that person would be interested or attracted sexually to you. Basically, they're asking you, would this person welcome your sexual attention, or does this person not want your sexual attention? And what they found was that when those two subjects, the real subject and the fake videotape subject, when they were put into a situation of equality, your perception of their sexual interest in you went down. When you were put into a position of power, so one of the things that they were giving for that experiment was credit, right? Course credit. And they told you either that the course credit was going to be split equally, putting you guys in a position of equality, or that you, at the end of the experiment, will decide how to split the course credit. You could take it all for yourself, or you could give 80% to you, 20% to your partner, but it's up to you. You have the power. In the power condition, perception of sexual interest in this videotaped partner went up. So people increase their perception of, yes, that person would want to date me. Yes, that person would want to, have sex with me. So just by having power, what that did was it took your noise distribution, where this person is not giving, does not want to have sex with you. It took that noise distribution and it pushed it forward. And that increases the amount of sexual harassment if you keep the same criteria. So that's oftentimes why a lot of times in sexual harassment, you'll hear that it's people in superior positions harassing people in inferior positions, because that power differential makes them think, oh, that person wants sexual attention. I'm seeing it. I'm perceiving it. It's not that and it's a misconception. It's a misconception that it's the idea that, oh, I'm in power and I'm untouchable, so I'm going to do what I want, right? That's kind of what a lot of people think in society, and some of them, I'm sure, have that perception that I'm in power, I'm untouchable, I'm going to do what I want. But psychology is telling us that most of the sexual harassment cases come down to the part where they thought that this person would welcome sexual attention while they did not want sexual attention. And the reason for that, at least partially, is because when you're in power over an individual, your noise distribution gets pushed this way, decreasing your sensitivity and increasing your false alarms, increasing your sexual harassment. And that's why one of the best policies beyond the rock test, beyond the rock test, one of the best policies that a lot of corporations are instituting or have already instituted is that you do not date your subordinates. You just do not. Because there is no criterion that's going to be high enough for you to be able to push this far enough, for this not to be pushed far enough, because of the power that you have over that particular individual. So it was one of the first, I remember when I was first going to be a TA, when I entered my master's program, I was going to be a teaching assistant for the first time. They had an orientation, 1 hour orientation, that was going to train you how to be a TA. And I thought it was going to be about how to grade exams, how to, do other things, administrative stuff. 45 minutes out of the hour was do not date your students. It was like 45 minutes, because I was in a position of power over them. They were, subordinate to me, not very much, but still, I was in a position of power over them. So I could not, psychology tells us, I can't read their signals, right? I have a loss of sensitivity because my noise distribution gets pushed. So whereas I might think that somebody's going to welcome a comment on their appearance or anything like that, chances are, a large chance, that it's going to be sexual harassment. So what they did is they basically said, don't date your students, don't comment on your students, don't tell them how, amazing they look. And what they did is they said, take that criterion and bring it all the way over here into the no amount of evidence is enough for you to do this. And sure enough, never sexually harassed anyone, because I never made that read, right? So those are the kind of policies that we need to, that signal detection theory can tell us whether they'll work or not. Because again, you can say, well, what about, sensitivity training? What if we, increase the noise? Well, you're still going to have people in powerful positions squeezing that noise distribution, because that's just, it's an interesting article, I'll post it in Canvas. It's just the way our perceptual systems work. And it's not that people are being jerks or people are being insensitive. It is just a quirk in our system that if you have power over people, you are more likely to read sexual interest in that person. Is there a question?
Yeah. Is it, for sexual harassment, is it always sexual attention, or is it sometimes just trying to recognize people? That is, you know what I mean? Sometimes people are friendly or just try to be encouraging, not necessarily try to hit on you or say something for sexual.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's not, and that's also one of the issues that comes across, because sometimes you just want to be encouraging, and it comes across non-encouraging, right? So you always hear that. That's one of the complaints about a lot of these policies where you'll hear people say, oh, you can't even compliment anybody anymore, right? You can't even compliment a person. And part of that is because
some of it, is
inappropriate. But again, sometimes you do want to give a compliment. Like you've noticed somebody has cleaned up their diet and has lost some weight, and you want to be encouraging, and you want to tell that person, hey, you know what? I've noticed your hard work and you're fitting into those jeans and looking amazing, right?
Yeah.
You might want to do that from an encouragement position. But very interestingly, signal detection is working in you, saying, I think this person wants a compliment. And we don't have it up here, but signal detection is working in the other person as well. Because the other person, when they hear that comment, they have to decide, is this comment supportive or was this comment harassment, right? Which one of those is it? So they have their own signal detection theory to do. And notice that you can say, there's different amounts of evidence to make that determination. You can say, wow, you look great in those jeans, probably supportive, versus, whoa, you look great in those jeans, probably not supportive, right? So there's that decision that the person receiving the information has to make as well. And again, it can be applied in the signal detection theory, how to make those correct decisions as well. Mm-hmm.
Is that why men seem to be more likely to be the ones to do the complimenting, because they tend to be like societally in power more so than women?
That does. So if you take a look at gender gaps in employment, one of the places where it gets larger is higher up in the sort of chain of command. So whereas for entry-level workers, it might be very equal. For manager positions, it might be very equal. As you keep going up, what you find is that the proportion of women goes down, 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 and down. So it could be exactly like you said, that it's not a male issue. It's not this idea of toxic masculinity that is doing this. It's a lot of it is a power issue at the very least in the workforce. And as much as one aspect of masculinity is that we need to be in power, right? Society expects us to always be in power. That could also contribute to it in an everyday situation. But if you ever take a look at people that got called out in the Me Too movement in Hollywood, and you take a look at who they harassed or who they assaulted, you will see a long list of males. But you will also see females in that list. So one of the most famous examples is Asia Argento. And she, just to kind of show you the weirdness that is occurring, she allegedly raped a 17-year-old boy that she worked with and directed in a film when I think he was like 8 or 9, right? So they kept they kept in contact, and then one day they were in a hotel room together, and at the very least, it's statutory, right? Because he's a minor, and he came out and said that she raped him, and she was a director on his movie, right? She had the power, he did not, right? And when I was looking through all these examples of people doing this, not one person assaulted or harassed their boss, right? Not one caterer ever went to Angelina Jolie and said something inappropriate, because there's just not that power differential. And they read the situation and they said, you know what? Angelina Jolie, one of the sexiest women of all time, rather a missed opportunity, right? Better shift my criterion over here. Whatever it was, it just doesn't happen. So a lot of it, I think, has to do with power, because they did look for gender differences in that study, and they didn't find any. Power affected both males and females equally.
I was just gonna say, I wonder too, because of my husband was in the military, and they talked about a lot of things when they were deployed, and it was overwhelming how many of the men were assaulted by friends' mothers. but like they never said anything because instead of sharing it, they take it as like you're supposed to be proud of those moments instead. You know what I mean? So it's like a shift of like it's like mental health and man, I don't need to go. I don't need to go to the doctor. Just go to the doctor. Like it's okay. Like you're not less of a man because you need to go to the doctor.
Yeah.
So I think that goes into play too of like the shift of society of I think women are gaining a voice to say things, so they say things more now than they used to.
Oh yeah.
I mean, watch Mad Men, which is a show, but I mean, it's like things have been around, but now women are a lot more vocal about it.
Yep. And the thing, the sort of one last thing that I'll just mention on this is that society does need to change. So that boy who was raped allegedly by Asia Argento, he revealed it, to the world. He tweeted it out, and he ended up on an Italian talk show, and he got laughed at when he said he got raped on that talk show. Can you imagine going on a talk show in America and saying, I was raped by so-and-so, and people in the audience laughing at you and dismissing your claims because they just couldn't believe it. They couldn't imagine that could have occurred, and he has still not filed charges.
Yeah.
Because of that.
I feel like that's the same case with Terry Crews.
Yeah.
Like, did we ever hear anything about what happened to the person that did that to him? No.
It's never gone.
Like,
It's never gone as far as other ones have. And it's one of those things where there is this shift in in society. I mean, it's happening, and a lot of it is going the way that it should go. But things like, again, analyses like this and psychological studies like that one on power can tell you what actually needs to be changed, right? So the power thing does not seem to be something that you can train out. So you need policies in place. The power thing affects males and women equally. So we can expect, as women continue to make progress in the workforce, that males are going to start getting harassed more and more unless these policies are put into place and adhered to. So, it's one of these things where it's a very complicated field, it's a very complicated issue, but you can take a look at paradigms like this that can get to the heart of the matter and tell you what you should be focusing on and how can we make those changes.
I was just going to ask, and if this is off topic, sure. But how do experts kind of understand that in cases of power, it's because the person in power just has perceived attractiveness of their subordinates, and that the subordinates aren't just scared to hit on them because they'll get fired?
It could be the second case as well. Okay. But in the experimental situation, it was a videotape that both groups saw the exact same tape. And the only difference between the groups was that one of the groups was put into an equal situation and one of them was put into a power situation. And then they just asked them questions like, how much do you think this person would be interested in dating you? How much do you think this person would be interested in engaging in sexual activity? And they found that the power group had higher ratings. So again, not the idea that, I want to engage in sexual activity with that person. That, I think they measured in another study. But how much do you think they are going to want you? Basically, how much do you think they are going to be over here? And what they found was that power just increased that, which tells you that if you want to, again, what that tells you is that this noise distribution is getting pushed up by power. So if you want to get rid of this, you got to take that criterion and you got to move it. And you got to have policies in the workplace that says, this is the amount of evidence that you need. And in some cases, move it all the way over here and just have a policy that says, no, you're not allowed.
Now, the power situation, would that kind of correlate with confidence? Because, people who are overly confident in their own appearance or their own attractiveness may perceive that someone else is attracted to them when they might not be, similar to the power situation?
It could be, in as much as confidence might lead to perceptions of power, right? So confidence is it's almost synonymous with effectiveness, right? If you're confident, you think that things that you're gonna try are gonna work out. If you're powerful, things you're gonna try are gonna work out. But the last thing I want to do, because I do want to introduce the picture perception topic on this, what they found in other studies of power is that when you're powerful, you tend to view things as objects towards your goal. So when you are in a position of power over somebody, you tend to see them less like a human being and more as a tool for your success. So if I'm leading a team and I'm in power over that team, one of the things that I will perceive them more is them in terms of their abilities. So this person can, has got great administrative skills. So, they can take care of all the, timetabling. This person over here has great stat skills. So I'll see them as a statistician rather than as, Stacy that, likes dogs and all that kind of stuff. So the more power you have over somebody, the more you kind of can perceive them as means to an end, right? Not to say it's totally right. It's not to say that as soon as you're put in charge of something, you're like, all right, you're a hammer and you're a saw. But it does occur. Now that again also gives you kind of interesting ways of kind of addressing these concerns and knowing what to do. So if it is a power situation, then you can go through all the sensitivity training that you want, but it's not going to be effective. That's a PR stunt, right? That's them saying, we gave them as a sensitivity training. We have their signatures that they attended that session, so you can't sue us if things go south, right? That's basically what a lot of corporations are doing. One thing though that can be done is have ways of taking away that power. And it's not necessarily being done in the best way, but if you have ways of the people above being accountable to the people below, if you have a system where you can exert some power over them, they will decrease because their perceptions of sexual interest, because they will no longer feel power over you. So there's a lot of different sources of power. There's formal power, which is the power of you actually have a position higher than somebody else. There's charismatic power. There's social power. There's a number of different places in power. So if you're a secretary, they can't give you formal power over your boss, right? They can't say, you're going to be able to fire your boss. That's just not the way that a corporation can work. But they can give them other forms of power in terms of ways of reporting. And that's one of the things that has occurred in the Me Too movement via social media, because one of the things that they found for people in positions of power now is that they are worried of being falsely accused. So they're worried about that. And what that means is that their feelings of power, if you're in power, you're not worried. But those feelings of power kind of went down a little bit. So I don't think it's the right kind of accountability, because I think social media and trial by population, what was that, popular court, what do they call it? The court of popular opinion, I think is horrible, because the legal system has a statute of limitations on persecuting people for crimes that they've done, And yet social media has no problem destroying careers for tweets that occurred 10, 15 years ago, right? So I think the system's out of whack right now, but I think it's the right principle to kind of put into place ways of taking power away from the people at the top. So they still got their formal power, they can still do their jobs, but at the same time, there's that idea of accountability to people at the bottom and ways for them to, administer some sort of effect. And at the very least, that'll take that perception away, just naturally, because that's how we feel psychologically. The more powerful you feel, the more you see people as means to an end. The less powerful you feel, the less you do. So that might be the way to do it. And again, is that looking at what psychology says, rather than what a lot of, I believe, the social institutions are doing, looking at what sounds right? So like sensitivity training sounds right? It sounds like something we should be doing. These people are being insensitive, right? Where'd they go? These people are being insensitive. Let's do sensitivity training. not going to work if you're still allowing bosses, to interact that way with their subordinates. All right, any final questions or comments before we wrap this up? All right, so pretty heady, important stuff. Let's we'll introduce. We're not going to get through the whole thing here, but we'll introduce it. So this is one of the things I like about my research is that it is almost about as benign as you can get, non-controversial as you can get. So sometimes psychology has to go into those areas. We want to understand all behavior. Sexual harassment is a behavior, but other times it's kind of nice to step back and say, let's take a look at something completely benign. So we're going to talk about picture perception here. It's going to be a special topic. We're going to spend a few classes on this. And we're just going to have time today to kind of introduce the idea. So we'll talk about why do we even want to study picture perception. A couple of reasons. Number two, and this is going to be more difficult than you might think, what is a picture? So when somebody says, oh, I study picture perception, what do they mean? What actually is a picture? And what we'll find is that a picture is, like a lot of concepts, something that is easy to recognize but incredibly hard to define. So I don't think any of you would have trouble if I showed you a photograph and I said, is this a picture? I don't think any of you would have false alarms or misses. I think everybody would be like, yep, that's a picture. No, that's not a picture. But when we actually try to define it, you'll see it's not that easy. So we'll take a look at some of the definitions. So a definition that I came up with about 10 years ago, spoiler alert, it's no good. And then we'll take a look at J.J. Gibson, who you might remember from the ecological online class. We'll take a look at Goodman, and then J.J. Gibson in his second attempt when he changed his mind. And then we'll take a look at some final objections to these ideas here, which is where I work in my lab, and that's on metaphoric pictures. All right, so why study picture perception? Well, one of the best reasons is just scientific curiosity. We can perceive pictures. If you remember Mars tri-level hypothesis, the first level is that computational level. What can we do? Well, we can perceive pictures. That's a behavior. So it's part of psychology. And if you want to have a complete theory of psychology, you have to understand picture perception. So some of it is just scientific curiosity. How do we do this? And then the other reason why picture perception seems to be such a fruitful area is that it's a test of perception theories. So your visual system was not developed in order to perceive pictures. So if you take a look at the evolution of your visual system, so here we have the evolution of man here, and Homo sapiens in their final form about 100,000 years ago. So there has not been very much change to our brains, to our bodies, since about 100,000 years ago. And the earliest cave paintings came about 32,000 years ago. So we were already Homo sapiens before we had our evidence that we were doing pictures, evidence of our earliest cave paintings. However, this was the end of our visual system development. Our visual system development actually started much, much earlier. And actually, just to make it an even better point, our visual system was done developing about 100,000 years ago, right? That's when we became Homo sapiens. That's when our brain had our occipital lobe. That's when we kind of finished our development of our visual system. So about 70,000 years later, we had our first pictures. So whatever we had developed here was clearly not intended for viewing pictures, because it was 70,000 years before we even have our evidence of our first pictures. So our picture perception, this ability to perceive pictures, actually must have piggybacked on your already existing visual system. It's sort of piggybacked on top of this already existing perceptual system. So what that means is that any theory that tries to explain vision has to be able to explain picture perception. It's like a criteria of the theory. And if you cannot explain picture perception, then that means that your theory is wrong. So if you have a theory that seems to work for perceiving the real world, and you apply it to picture perception and it fails, that means that your theory is wrong. So picture perception is actually one of these great tests for determining and developing visual theories. Because if you can develop a theory of picture perception that works with pictures, and it also works with the real world, that is going to be very highly likely to be a successful successful perception theory, visual perception theory. So picture perception is one of these great tests. It's kind of like this cleaver, this litmus test for whether or not a theory of vision actually is true. Apply it to pictures. If it fails, it cannot be true. Again, because picture perception is not its own mechanism. It piggybacked on this already existing visual system that we developed 70,000 years before we had our first evidence of pictures. All right, so that's why we study picture perception. So what is a picture? Like I mentioned, you'll know them when you see them, but they're actually very, very difficult to identify, to define. So here we have a picture. Does anybody know what this is a picture of?
Tiger.
This is a picture of a tiger. How about this?
Soccer.
Yeah.
That is a picture of people playing soccer. And what about this? That one's a mystery. I don't know what that one is. But you can see that pictures, there's something about pictures, you being able to represent things in a picture. So this is, let's face it, a horrible picture of a tiger. I'm sorry if you're in Sunnydale School right now. But this is, I mean, it's not accurate. However, it's a successful picture of a tiger. Because when I said, what is this? Everybody here was like, it looks like a tiger. So on the one hand, it doesn't look at all like a tiger. And on the other hand, it looks exactly like a tiger, right? This doesn't look at all like humans playing soccer. And on the other hand, it looks exactly like humans playing soccer. And then this one over here kind of fails because we can't tell what it is, right? It doesn't represent, we can't pick up on that information. And again, we have here a picture of a tiger. We have here a picture of a tiger. This is another picture of a tiger. This is another picture of a tiger. So very different levels of detail, very different levels of accuracy, very different types of pictures, and yet they all are successful at representing tigers. So there is something in common with all of these that let us know that this is the same thing as this, is the same thing as this, is the same thing as this. They're all tigers, even though they look vastly different. All right, what is a picture? So here we have a line drawing of a model airplane. That is a picture. Here we have a photo of a bridge in Venice. Once again, that is a picture. Completely different in their level of detail. Photorealistic, line drawing, full color, black and white, in perspective, in plain view or parallel view here. So completely different, and yet still, both of those would be considered pictures. All right, so here we have Son of Man by René Magritte, and René Magritte is one of those painters that loves to toy with what a picture is and what our expectations of a picture is. And one of the ones that he did, which I love, is called The Treachery of Images. And this is, if you asked anybody, what is this? They would say this is a pipe. And right down here he goes, that is not a pipe. And just showing you the treachery of images, because this is a representation of a pipe. This is a picture of a pipe. And if you want to take it even further, this is a scan of a picture of a pipe. If you want to take it even further, this is a projection of a scan of a picture of a pipe. And yet we still kind of cut through all that and say, oh yeah, no, it's a pipe. Because we can see and perceive what is being represented. So other examples here. Oh yeah, so what is a picture? So we'll cover my horrible definition first, and then we'll talk about the good ones next time. So when I started picture perception, I thought to myself, all right, let me see if I can do what Gibson did. Start from the beginning, go back to the assumptions, and come up with a definition that will be beneficial for studying pictures. So I defined a picture as a non-propositional visual representation on a two-dimensional plane. So this is a non-propositional definition. So once again, a picture is a non-propositional, not language, visual representation, so it's visual, and it's on a two-dimensional plane. So this is an example of a picture of the Mona Lisa. So this is non-propositional. This is visual. It's on a two-dimensional plane. So that's a picture of Mona Lisa. This, on the other hand, is not a picture of Mona Lisa. This Caucasian female with long dark hair, hands folded on lap, mysterious smile, etc., etc. That is not a picture of Mona Lisa because this is propositional, right? This is just a series of statements about this particular picture. This is the 1,000 words that everybody says a picture is worth. This is the actual picture. So on the one hand, the definition seems to be successful so far. Because again, if I asked you, is this a picture? You would be like, yep. If I said, is this a picture? You'd be like, nope. So far, so good. So it works here. Again, non-propositional. We have the pipe here. This is non-propositional. It can have a little bit, but or maybe it could have a proposition, but it starts to break down in terms of the definition. But once again, non-propositional, visual, two-dimensional plane. So I bring this one up because it kind of shows two things, which again, Gibson will show as well. Number one, scientists can get it wrong sometimes. So this was my first attempt to define a picture, and it was actually a very poor definition. So I didn't get it right the first time. But it's very interesting to know why it's a poor definition, and this is a red flag that I want to plant in your minds to remember this whenever you hear this type of a definition. And the reason this fails as a definition is because it's saying that a picture is a non-propositional visual representation on a two-dimensional plane. This is a negative definition. And I want everybody to remember for the rest of their careers, whatever you do, wherever you are, negative definitions are red flags. And they're an indication that, much like myself back in 2006, you do not really understand what it is that you're trying to define. So keep that in mind. So this is a negative definition because it doesn't say what a picture is. It says what a picture isn't. So it doesn't say a picture is something. It says a picture is not this. And that's a negative definition. And negative definitions are pretty useless because while it sounds convincing, it doesn't tell you what it is. And you can always do a negative definition without knowing anything almost about what you're trying to define. So a picture is not a bowl of Jell-O, right? I'm right? It's true. A picture is not a cool breeze on a summer day, right? It's not. Both of those are true. Both of those are useless because they're negative definitions. So this is just my PSA. Any single time that you come across in your career a negative definition, a definition of what something is not, let that little red flag pop up and say, whoa, 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 whoa. Sounds completely reasonable, right? This sounds reasonable. It sounded great to me. It sounded great to other people when I first told them. It sounded horrible to my supervisor as soon as I told him, and he explained to me why. So just have that in your mind. Not a good definition to be a negative definition. So one other reason, it's a circular definition as well. So what is non-propositional? Well, non-propositional is anything that's not linguistic, like pictures, music, or sculpture. What is a picture? Well, it's something that's non-propositional. What's non-propositional? Well, it's not pictures. Well, what's a picture? Well, it's non-propositional. You're getting nowhere. It's very ineffective. So we'll continue with just a few more examples of what pictures are, what pictures can represent, just so you can kind of understand the scope of what we're trying to do in cognitive psychology to understand pictures. So one of the kind of mysteries to and fascinating things about pictures is that pictures can represent like almost an infinite number of things. So pictures can represent things that actually exist. So pictures can represent lions and sunsets. And also pictures can represent things that do not exist nor have ever existed. So to my knowledge, unicorns are completely fictional. And yet there's a picture of a unicorn, and everybody understands, yep, that is a picture of a unicorn. So it can represent things that exist, things that do not exist. Pictures can represent things that can be seen, so a basket full of apples. Pictures can represent things that cannot be seen. So you can literally, in a visual medium, represent things that are not visual. So one great example of this is conceptions like love and intimacy, and in the realm which cannot be seen, and in one of the realms of research that I delve in, you can literally represent invisibility in a visual medium. So this is the invisible woman. She is literally a thing that cannot be seen, and you view this and you understand it, and yet there she is. So again, it's just kind of like, how is this being done? That's driving a lot of that research. A lot of times I also take a look at whether propositions help with that. Most of the time they do not, but once again, you realize that this is not some dotted outline that somebody drew on a wall of the invisible woman. This is actually invisibility. So we're going to leave it with one last example. And this is the idea that pictures can also represent space. So a lot of picture perception has to do with spatial perception. And to complicate this, just to kind of, again, show you the scope, this is two-dimensional space. So a picture can represent two-dimensional space. You cannot make two-dimensional space. You can't make anything that's 2D in the real world. It'll always have 3 dimensions. And yet we know here, looking at this square, yep, that's a two-dimensional representation. It's got length and width. You can represent 1 dimension. So there's a line, 1 dimension, only has length. We see that it has a little bit of width, but we understand that it's representing something that only has length. You can represent 0 dimensions, just a point in space, no length, no width, no depth. You can represent 3 dimensions, right? You can extend into the 3rd dimension in a 2-dimensional plane. And you can go further. You can go into the 4th dimension, and you can get yourself a tesseract by, once again, representing and going into that 4th dimension to get a cube, where each side of that cube is actually another cube. And I will leave you with this, which is a projection of a 4-dimensional cube into 3-dimensional space, reprojected onto 2-dimensional space. And that's what a 4-dimensional cube rotating would look like in a 3-dimensional world. So just the same way that my hand here, a 3-dimensional object, casts a shadow when I project it onto this 2-dimensional plane and I rotate it and my shadow changes, that's a 4-dimensional cube being rotated, and that's what it looks like in 3-dimensional space. And here it is represented in this moving picture, but a picture nonetheless. All right, so I'm going to leave you with that. Blow your mind for now. And next time we're going to pick up on this. And just to let you know, I gave everybody an announcement. There's the link to my article on metaphoric pictures. So if you read the announcement, you already know this, but if you haven't, check the announcement for the link. Give it a try. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging than your textbook, but give it a try, give it a go. But I'm going to do the lecture as if you haven't read it. So don't be worried if you can't make it through, but if you are able to read it and come to class prepared, you'll get more out of the lecture. Other than that, we are done for today.